It is 9. This is Berlin Calling. A very warm welcome to all our friends and guests from all around the world to this year's anniversary edition of the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum. My name is Liana Fix, I'm the program director of the forum, and as you all can see, this conference setup looks a little bit different from what we and you expected. Instead of a bustling crowds of guests chatting over coffee, we now have a lot of technicians bending over screens. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, last year we had to conduct the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum for the first time in a hybrid format, with over 1,000 guests and 70,000 live stream viewers. This year we hope to welcome you in person. The pandemic has once again thwarted our plans, but we decided, in the spirit of this year's forum, to see the chances in change. It's therefore my great pleasure to welcome and to talk to a small part of the 1,400 participants that registered to this year's Berlin Foreign Policy Forum. Hello everyone, good morning and welcome. And I think there should be somewhere also our moderator, Alex Tam, with us. Hi Alex, good morning.
Hi, Liana. It's a pleasure to see you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's good to see you. How's the mood in the group?
Yeah, we already had Berlin Calling, 15 minutes of getting to know each other, to get started into the day of this very important conference. We talked about where people are coming from, what policy issues they bring here to the forum, and also what they would like to be discussed. And we already had two first small interviews on Ukraine and Asia from Japan. So very exciting 15 minutes, and we're looking forward to the conference.
Wonderful. Do you have an idea where all the participants come from? Who's joining us today?
Yeah, we actually do. We asked where everybody is from. Of course, we did a little word cloud. There are, of course, Berlin, Hamburg represented, as it's used for the Körber Foundation. That's where we are from. But participants are here from Washington, D.C. to Japan, and of course, from all major European capitals, being here today to get a view on German foreign policy here at the Berlin Forum.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you to all our participants. Enjoy the day. Have a day full of inspiring discussions and contribute your questions and comments whenever you feel like.
Thank you, Liana.
Thank you, Alex. And now we will kick off the Berlin Forum with opening remarks by Thomas Paulsen, member of the Executive Board of Körber Foundation, followed by a speech by German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for joining here at the Berlin Calling, and now you can join over the conference platform for the live stream of the opening of the conference. Thank you very much for being with us here and joining us these 15 minutes, and let's keep the funky mood. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of Körber-Stiftung to the 10th anniversary of the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum. We founded the Berlin Forum in 2011, 10 years ago, together with the Federal Foreign Office. 2011 marked the 60th anniversary of the new Federal Foreign Office after World War II. And at the time, we both thought that Berlin needs a space for a regular and open discussion of core questions of German and European foreign policy. Niinistö, we asked about the spirit of Helsinki and discussed the value of dialogue in our times of increasing great power competition. Today, we will continue
this debate with talks about the future of German foreign policy post-Merkel, transatlantic relations, Europe's neighborhood, and much more. While the world is still battling the consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, new tasks are waiting to be addressed. Digitalization or climate crisis, to name but two. Ladies and gentlemen, you are all familiar with the image of the Germans to be a bit grumpy and a bit pessimistic all the time, German Angst. We wanted to leave German Angst behind us for this forum and decided that we do not want to discuss only the great challenges and threats of our time. Rather, we want to look at the opportunities in transformation. And that's why the title of this year's forum is not Challenges Ahead, but Chances in Change, German Foreign Policy in an Era of Transformation. How can the digital transformation be turned into an opportunity for the EU to become a truly sovereign actor? How can we strengthen transatlantic relations and work also with difficult states and actors on topics like the climate crisis? And what are the lessons learned from Afghanistan? Today, we will also launch the 5th edition of our flagship publication, The Pulse, the Berlin Pulse, with a brand new public opinion survey. For the German public, the tasks ahead for Germany's foreign policy post-Merkel are quite clear. With 21%, climate change is perceived as the biggest challenge for German foreign policy after Afghanistan. As the survey was conducted in September, many Germans were still under the impression of the immediate events in Afghanistan at the time. Despite the dismal experience of Afghanistan, the attitude of the German public towards engagement or restraint in international crises has not changed. 50% prefer restraint, 45% more involvement, and these numbers have been the same for many years now. And within the European Union, 65% of Germans would like the next German Chancellor to strengthen common foreign and security policy. I'm eager to hear what our fantastic speakers will be saying about the results, and I'm eager to hear your questions in our new conference platform and with the hashtag #BerlinForum. I encourage you to take part in our pollings and connect in exclusive background discussions. Jana Fix, Program Director of the Berlin Forum, will lead us through the day. Finally, I would like to thank the Federal Foreign Office for the excellent cooperation in 10 years Berlin Foreign Policy Forum. We are honored and grateful that German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas continues the tradition of opening the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum for the 4th time in a row. Minister, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
So, dear Mr. Paulsen, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, unfortunately not here with us. 10 years ago, the first Berlin Foreign Policy took place. Since then, the forum has become an institution in the German foreign policy debate. I therefore warmly congratulate the forum, the Körber Foundation, and you, dear Mr. Paulsen, on this anniversary, and I would like to wish you many, many more years, because it has shown that this forum triggers impulses into politics that are regarded there and from which consequences will be drawn. Dear ladies and gentlemen, for Germany, the world was a different place in 2011, the year of your first meeting, than it is today. And few of us would have expected then what has happened internationally since then. The Arab Spring, a topic discussed full of hope at the first Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, was followed by bloody civil wars instead of democratic transformation. The euro and the refugee crisis have shaken the European Union, and with Brexit, a member state has left the Union for the first time. With its annexation of Crimea, Russia has called the European peace order into question completely. Rivalries between regional and major powers, especially between the US and China, have intensified dramatically ever since. Donald Trump was president of the United States for 4 years, and in many countries, populists and nationalists are poisoning domestic and foreign policy. And most recently, the pandemic has cost countless lives around the world, while the dangers of climate change have arrived on our own doorstep. In short, Germany has lived through an era of international crisis over the past decade that has shaken many of our certainties. German foreign policy in the past decade, that meant above all crisis management and sometimes simply damage control. Our recent foreign policy past thus raises a very fundamental question. Why have the past crises taken us by such surprise, and what do they mean for Germany's role in the world? Dear ladies and gentlemen, to answer that question, it's worth taking a look at The End of Illusions, a book by sociologist Andreas Reckwitz. The book describes how, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008, Western ideas of progress have fallen into crisis. Economic globalization, social liberalization, and new technologies have created unprecedented opportunities, but they have also fueled extreme inequality and political polarization. The title, The End of Illusions, captures these social developments. But in my view, it also fits the foreign policy debate in Germany in recent years. After all, many of our ideas about progress in foreign policy have recently begun to falter. The idea that European integration is progressing irreversibly, for instance, the idea that economic power and networking will gradually replace military power in world politics, and the idea that states around the world are converging on the Western model of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, and that time is playing for us in this process. Dear ladies and gentlemen, that these ideas were illusory, at least in part, nowhere has this become more painfully clear than in Afghanistan recently. The events of the past months there have been bitter, first for the Afghans, but also for us. So, together with our allies, we fought international terrorism successfully in Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. The country has also made progress in human development over the past 20 years that cannot simply be reversed. At the same time, however, our failure in Afghanistan is obvious. The establishment of a sustainable political order with democratic government, an effective bureaucracy, and a functioning army has failed. That's why Afghanistan means a cut. We must not infer from the deployment that Germany should no longer assume international responsibility in the future anymore. So, the defense against terrorist threats, for example, which can arrive in Europe very quickly, continues to justify Bundeswehr missions abroad. But nevertheless, it's clear that our levers to influence other countries have limits. More resources do not necessarily bring better results. Exporting forms of government that are agreeable to us cannot be claim of foreign German policy alone. Instead, this German foreign policy must in future set itself realistic goals that correspond to clearly defined German interests. Or, to put it more pointedly, it's time for an end to illusions. Dear ladies and gentlemen, this demand sounds harsh at first, like cynicism, resignation, and retreat. However, I advocate, and so does Reckwitz in the book I mentioned, seeing disillusionment as an opportunity, for a new political sobriety, for undogmatic confidence, for pragmatic realism. Precisely such realism also opens up new perspectives for the German foreign policy debate. It leaves behind exaggerated hopes for an end of history, but it also avoids an equally exaggerated pessimism and alarmism that has recently become widespread in many foreign policy speeches in Germany. Because objectivity, and not exuberance or fear, is the right basis for an analysis of Germany's situation in the world. And such call it realistic analysis, results in 3 points from my point of view. Firstly, world politics is going through an era of transformation, as the title of this year's forum puts it. The multipolarization of the international order is fueling economic, technological, diplomatic, and military competition between states. At the same time, however, networking and global challenges, such as climate change, are also leading to more cooperation between these very same states. A paradoxical international system is emerging in which there is simultaneously more competition but also more cooperation, a system in which more separates states while at the same time they are closer than ever before. Secondly, Germany has all the prerequisites to survive in such a competitive, cooperative and networked world. Our economy is strong, our society is stable, our state is capable of acting. We have strong partners and allies in the European Union and NATO and worldwide. We are an active player in global multilateralism. Many forecasts of disintegration in recent years, on the other hand, have turned out to be exaggerated. Neither the European Union, NATO, nor the West have broken up as many predicted. The United Nations are in need of reform, but just as resilient, and the pandemic has hit the global economy much less hard than initially feared. Thirdly, on the basis of this analysis of the situation, Germany must continue to pursue the ambitious foreign policy course it has embarked upon in recent years. To achieve this, German foreign policy must be more than an extension of German domestic policy. Otherwise, noble German aspirations will collide with global political realities. In a world of competition and cooperation, there's 2 priorities of realistic German foreign policy that have no alternative. We must strengthen our own position, and we must cooperate more with all the states of the world. Dear ladies and gentlemen, on the one hand, it means dialogue with those who do not share our values. So the nature of diplomacy is not to have parties with friends, but to get the difficult partners around the table to negotiate. Thus, we're not pursuing a policy of renunciation, but a policy of reason, as Willy Brandt once aptly put it. Because maximum pressure and attempts at isolation, decoupling, or the insistence on one's own moral superiority rarely lead to the goal in international politics. And that is why it is important that Germany is to advocate diplomatic solutions to conflicts and antagonisms worldwide, also if this initially will not be understood domestically or give rise to criticism. In Libya, we have helped with the Berlin process so that the weapons are silent there after years of civil war. I don't know how often people recommended to me to stay away from this. This wouldn't work. With our E3 partners, France and the UK, we've kept the nuclear agreement with Iran alive, and that was difficult enough. And in a few days, at long last, talks between all parties will finally take place again in Vienna. With the Stockholm Initiative and our future weapons conferences, we've put arms control on the international agenda in difficult times once again. And also the antagonism in the Eastern Mediterranean and NATO, we try to reduce that using diplomacy. Furthermore, we need international cooperation also to address the global challenges of our time. Climate protection, health, global justice. So that such cooperation is worthwhile is what the climate summit COP26 has just shown. Yes, you can criticize the results of the conference, but compared to where the international debate on climate protection stood just a few years ago, the agreements reached in Glasgow are absolutely remarkable. This also applies to cooperation in the G20. The agreement on a worldwide taxation of corporate profits is a step towards more global justice that no one would have expected for a long time. In the fight against the virus, too, it is right that we continue to rely on multilateral solutions. The COVAX vaccination platform, of which Germany is the second largest supporter, has so far delivered around 500 million vaccine doses to 3/4 of the countries worldwide. And finally, this is precisely the work on humanity issues that we have also taken forward with the Alliance for Multilateralism in Turbulent Times. And meanwhile, there's 70 countries members of this alliance. Dear ladies and gentlemen, on the other hand, realistic German foreign policy also means that we recognize dangers, represent our concerns vigorously, and defend our values. We will not succeed from a position of weakness. Incidentally, Willy Brandt coined an apt phrase about this too. Peace policy must mean more than applauding others only. The foundation of our influence in the world is social cohesion and a strong economy here at home. And nothing's going to change. That is why it's important that the coming federal government will continue to invest in social justice, modernization and innovation in our country. Also to make us able to act on a foreign policy stage. Germany must compete internationally for key technologies, defend technological leadership, and reduce vulnerabilities. We've seen this in the pandemic in a bitter way. And this requires research and development, but also better protection of our know-how. That is why, over the past years, in our foreign trade legislation, we have tightened up this legislation, and the new IT Security Act is an important step towards protecting our critical infrastructure. In addition, Germany must continue to make its contribution to the Atlantic Alliance, the unshakable cornerstone of our security. So we have launched the so-called reflection process in NATO, which will be incorporated into a new strategic concept next year. And that is absolutely necessary. It must prepare NATO for new challenges, for example, in cyber and space. And in addition, we must also be aware that Germany is in a competition of systems internationally. Authoritarian states like Russia and China are putting pressure on the rules-based order, international law, and universal human rights. Hybrid threats and disinformation are gnawing away at our open societies. More than ever before. And let me be clear, the Chinese system stands for autocratic values that we in democratic states do not want to live by. That needs to be shown and displayed in our policy as well. That's why Germany has been building new coalitions and expanding partnerships with like-minded countries. From the G7 to our new Indo-Pacific guidelines to the Summit for Democracy, which President Biden has invited us to attend next month. So because Germany is not strong alone, but only with partners. Dear ladies and gentlemen, which brings me to my next and perhaps most important point, and that is Europe. The unalterable principle of any realistic German foreign policy remains, with our history, geography, and economic weight, we bear special responsibility for the future of the European Union and thus our entire continent. We must meet this responsibility with a sense of proportion, not with hooray federalism or German lectures. Our aim must continue to be to keep the European Union together internally and to make it more sovereign externally. During the pandemic, the joint procurement of vaccines and the agreement on the European Recovery Fund were a decisive success, achieved, by the way, during the German Council presidency and driven by the Franco-German motor. For Europe's cohesion, it is also crucial that Germany remains a bridge builder to the Central and Eastern European member states. The fundamental values of the European Union, democracy, the rule of law, freedom of the media, unite and bind us all. We also need further steps towards more European integration, but at the same time it is clear that a division of the European Union into East and West, in a two-speed Europe, which our Eastern neighbors perceive rather as a first and second-class Europe, and they're sitting in the second class, will weaken us all and will endanger European Union. The views of the Central and Eastern European member states must also be taken into account in a common European Eastern policy, vis-à-vis partners such as Ukraine and Moldova, and vis-à-vis Belarus and Russia. That's why I would like to make it clear once again that we want better relations with Russia. Of course, we can only improve. However, this requires progress, especially in resolving the conflict in eastern Ukraine, on the basis of the Minsk agreements, by the way. Most recently, however, Russia has refused to meet the foreign minister of the Normandy format, and the latest news about the Russian troop movements in the border area with Ukraine worry us extremely. These events show the ball is in Moscow's court when it comes to resolving existing differences. The European Union will continue to speak with one voice here, and I'm firmly convinced of that. Dear ladies and gentlemen, so this brings us to the question of Europe's external sovereignty already. So let us continue to build on the strengths of the European Union, its economic strength and its regulatory power. We need progress on trade agreements between the European Union and important partners worldwide. Trade agreements, as many assume, is nothing bad as such. So we want to live in a free world, and free trade is part of the free world. In this way, we can advance environmental and social standards internationally instead of putting them at risk through isolationism, and at the same time, we must continue to fight against unfair trade practices. And also, we need to make progress in developing and setting standards for new technologies. This includes close cooperation with partners like the United States, as we have put on the rails with the Trade and Technology Council. And during the French presidency next year, we want to build on our progress on European security and defense policy, such as the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO. So, last week, High Representative Josep Borrell presented a first draft of the strategic compass, which points to the right way forward. Absolutely. I just want to make one point that is particularly important to me. The latest development in the Western Balkans. So, just on the very doorstep, the tensions between Serbia and Kosovo and the aggravated international political situation in Bosnia will show Europe must first demonstrate its credibility and ability to act in its neighborhood. For the best Western Balkans, we need new dynamism in the accession process, and on the other hand, a discussion on sanctions against those who pursue obstructionist policy with hatred and agitation. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, so keeping Europe together internally and making it more sovereign externally, strengthening Germany and at the same time expanding international cooperation, German responsibility in the world, but also honesty about the limitations of our possibilities. This is the way forward for German foreign policy, and here also lies the proof that a virtue can be made out of the end of illusions, out of illusionlessness, if it leads into a realism that learns from mistakes, promotes new ideas, and continues the tried and tested. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Minister Maas.
Thank you.
Maas, for this tour d'horizon of the last 10 years of German foreign policy. I'm delighted that we can now continue the debate with an excellent opening panel at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum on future-proof Germany and Europe in an era of transformation. The panel will be moderated by Shakuntala Banerjee, Deputy Head of the CDF Berlin Studio, who's joined by Franziska Brantner, Timothy Garton, Bernadett, Szél, and Nathalie, Loiseau. You have the chance to contribute your questions and comments via our conference platform. And just a short technical remark, please make sure that you are in the right session and you see a Q&A button to contribute your questions. We hope you enjoy the discussions, and with this, a very warm welcome to our panelists, both inside and online. The floor is yours.
All right, have a seat.
Sehen die uns? Ja, hoffentlich. I hope they see us.
All right, I just got the sign that we can start. Good morning to everybody here in Berlin, as well as outside in front of your computer screens, mostly, I assume. I'm very glad to be able to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this opening panel of the Berlin Forum Berlin's Foreign Policy Forum 2020. I'll be your host for the upcoming roughly 60 minutes. My name is Shakuntala Banerjee. I work for German television ZDF. I'm a co-host of a weekly magazine, mostly concentrating on German domestic policies, but nowadays this also means a lot of foreign policy, as sometimes it's not clear where, how to distinguish these two. And now I found the camera where you can look me in the eye. I'm very happy that we get this running right now. I welcome you to, as I would say, a quick tour through the most pressing challenges that we are right now facing in Europe and in German-European relations. And I have to admit that I had a brief moment of nostalgia and even despair this morning when I looked at my list of topics that we could discuss today. Nostalgia because I was thinking of the old days where usually a conference on foreign policy concentrated on one major topic and one major challenge of the time, and I stopped counting this morning at 10. That was the moment of despair, where I knew that we will not be able to discuss all of them within 60 minutes. We hope that we can touch a few of the so-called homemade problems that we have in Europe. And later on, please feel free if when we come to opening the panel and when we come to your questions from the audience, to broaden the scale and also to ask your questions concerning other areas of interest. I'm happy that I'm not alone in this room, that Corona is allowing us to have some guests on the podium. So I welcome Bernadett Szél. She's independent. She's an independent member of the Hungarian Parliament, member of the opposition. She holds a seat in the Committee of European Affairs, and right now she's running her campaign for the upcoming elections in Hungary in the next spring. Welcome to Berlin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And a warm welcome too to Franziska Brantner, also here in Berlin. She's member of the German Parliament, an expert on EU affairs. She's member of the party Alliance 90, the Greens, who are, as we speak, trying to finalize the coalition agreement for Germany's next government. And I think we should also mention that her name keeps popping up in speculations about who will become a future head of her party. So maybe we would see her in a more important role in the time to come. Good morning.
Thank you for being.
Digitally with us are Nathalie Loiseau and Timothy Garton-Ash. A warm welcome to Nathalie Loiseau, current chair of the Subcommittee of Security and Defense in the European Parliament. She was Minister of European Affairs in the French government from 2017 to 2019. She was also head of the Renaissance list for the European elections of 2019, and thus I assume quite close to Emmanuel Macron's efforts to push for reforms in the European Union. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. And Timothy Garton-Ash, last but not least, Professor of European Studies, author of 10 books of contemporary history and political writing, and as I took from my readings, an intimate expert on all questions of concerning Germany's special relations with Europe and the European Union. Thank you for being with us. Good morning.
Nice to be with you.
All right, the title of this podium includes the word future-proof, and the question, how future-proof is Europe and which role does Germany have in this context? We can choose from a broad range of problems here. Just to name a few, could be coronavirus, digitalization, European integration, the rule of law. I would like to start with one which is currently stirring emotions, and I think is a good example for where we currently stand. It's the crisis at the border between Belarus and Poland, and I would like to start with Bernadett Szél. We are right now hearing a lot of comparison with the crisis of European migration policy in 2015. At that time, back then, the Hungarian government was the first to propagate the closure of EU borders as a solution to the problem. And if we look at the situation today, facing Lukashenko's methods, it seems that Viktor Orban might have been right. My question to you is, how future-proof is a European Union that cannot manage migration?
Well, basically, it's a very interesting question in Hungary as well, because as we listen to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the new vice president of the governing party, Fidesz, they blame the EU for this conflict. But of course, it's not true. Basically, what happened is the fault of Putin and Lukashenko, and the whole situation is not to blame on the EU. But the propaganda in Hungary says the opposite, which is a big problem. So I think future-proof is when we do not have a propaganda, future-proof is when we talk sincerely about our problems. And I know that the EU can handle a lot of issues and a lot of conflicts and problems. And I am with those leaders who try to give a solution to the problem and not just criticize the situation and the problem. I don't think it's very constructive. So I would say that if we want a future-proof Europe, and if we want future-proof solutions, we have to choose those kind of leaders who can not only criticize, but give solutions, and not only make propaganda, but try to cooperate to find a solution.
It is a very heated discussion. It started in 2015 and it's still going on, and it's taking a new momentum right now. And Timothy Garton-Ash, you've been monitoring Eastern European countries closely for decades. Do you agree with the ones who now say we are not witnessing a new migration crisis, but rather an attempt to destabilize the EU by putting pressure on Poland and thus putting pressure on the EU as a whole?
Can I start by saying, as a historian, that nobody is future-proof. And the best way to prepare yourself for the future is not to have the illusion that you can be future-proof, but to know you can't be. And this was a good example of that, because who would have thought a month or two ago that Lukashenko would hit upon this tactic? The answer to your question is that it is both. It is indeed a form of hybrid war, a deliberate aggression by Lukashenko and behind him Vladimir Putin attempting to destabilize the EU, but at the same time it's a genuine human drama. These are tragic stories of individuals who face terrible suffering in their home countries and are just seeking a better life. And that's a a story we have all round the edges of the European Union. And so the very difficult balancing act we have to do is indeed to secure our borders, the entire borders of Europe, and ensure that that tactic does not succeed, whether it comes from Belarus or from Turkey or indeed from Morocco, as happened more recently in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, but at the same time to maintain our European standards and have a genuinely humanitarian approach to these genuine refugees and migrants from extreme suffering. The Polish government has been correct on the first, but has fallen down badly on the second.
Thank you very much. I will still stick to the term of future-proof, just for reasons of practicability in this round. But you explained it quite brilliantly. The balancing act that you described, I think the European Union hasn't been very good at mastering exactly this in the recent past. Franziska, Brantner, when you look at this, how future-proof is the EU if it can be destabilized so easily by just reinitializing the migration debate?
Yeah, I think that we are still quite vulnerable, and we have been not solving the migration crisis for much longer than 2015, because I think it's a mistake to say it started 2015. We had the debates with Italy much earlier on. What changed was in 2015 is that Germany was then becoming ready to accept refugees, to have a distribution. And before that, Germany was advocating vehemently against it. But it has shifted in the German perspective in 2015. But for many of the border countries, it's a much older problem. And I think that we have been postponing it. And I think that if we do not address it, if we do not find the right balance between order and humanitarian grounds, we will be vulnerable for Lukashenko, for Moroccans, for whoever. And I firmly believe that we will not find a solution with the 27. We will need to start with smaller alliances, go that way, find legal access points, and find steps that pragmatically lead us to a more balanced approach in that question. If we don't do it, I think we will be vulnerable. And then we also have to act more forcefully against actors like Lukashenko. The sanctions are not tough enough. Trade actually has increased with Belarus over the last couple of weeks and months. So there is not a real sanction regime in place. And I think that is also part of the answer.
A follow-up for you, because you said that it might be the right approach to form this coalition of the willings and go forward in that way. That did not seem to have helped in the recent past.
We have never really done it. I have not seen that we were ready to say, okay, we will form now an alliance of 4, 7, 11, 15, how many member states we are, to set up a permanent ordered, structured system that we start with small little steps pragmatically to get a better way of handling these problems. We have not. We had a previous interior minister who came up with proposals that were from the beginning clear to be in a trash bin because it was not possible to implement them. And we have not had an interior minister who has been traveling around Europe to find solutions and compromises. And I hope that we will be better in the next government.
As the migration pressure has now itself migrated towards the east, a quick question for you, Bernadett, Szél. Do you think that that Poland is now looking differently at the whole topic since it's experiencing the pressure firsthand?
Well, basically, having a very close view at the whole situation might changes the objective, but basically what we see is that I am sure that they see the origin of the problem, and that's very important to be very realistic about how the pressure comes from and to be very realistic about that, whether we want to solve the problem or we want to get use of the problem. And I really trust that our politicians in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and everywhere in Europe want to solve this problem and not get use out of this problem. That's the main issue about being future-proof, trying to solve and not make political use of it.
Let's bring in Nathalie Loiseau. You are chair of the Subcommittee on Security and Defense in the EP. We just heard about the difficult balancing act, and when you look at Lukashenko's method, the aspect human beings as an instrument of hybrid threats, how should Europe react?
It is clearly not a migration crisis. People were brought to Minsk, where they didn't even know where it was on the map, by a dictator, Lukashenko, to try to put pressure on the European Union. This is precisely what we call hybrid war, and hybrid war has started. We have to face it, and we have to be firm in our answer to the blackmail of Lukashenko. And I think there are a few lessons already that can be learned from this crisis. Poland was tempted to use the military way, asking British troops to come in, asking bilaterally to some member states to bring military to the border. You don't use military when you have human beings in front of you, civilians with no weapons. You use what the European Union is good at. And we have started to win the first part of the battle with Lukashenko by threatening of sanctions. Lukashenko has started slowly and not completely to step back. And I think the European Union should stop portraying itself as weak or vulnerable to these kind of threats. Because look, when Turkey tried a few months ago to blackmail us with migrants, it stopped. When Morocco had this weird idea of letting people enter Ceuta, it didn't last more than 24 hours. Meaning that whether we know it or not, we can be powerful. We can react. There is no reason that others, and especially a dictatorship like Belarus of Lukashenko, decides who enters in Europe. But we also have to tackle the crisis which trigger this migration flows, because otherwise there will always be a way to try to enter Europe. We have been slow and sort of a sleeping beauty in crises like Syria, like Libya, even if we are making progress like right now, like a number of places. And we have to engage more in firmer risk-taking, I would say, diplomacy. Things don't always work, but we need to give them a try. Otherwise, we cannot blame the US because they are turning their back, or Russia, or Turkey, or others because they are stepping in. Where are we? And the last thing I would like to say is that I don't think we are vulnerable. On a domestic front, I looked very closely to the German political campaign. The far right in Germany tried to make use of the fear of Afghan migrants coming to Germany. It didn't work. It played very poorly with German voters. And I have to praise the German electoral campaign for making so little use of these migration threats that we hear elsewhere in Europe.
I could see Timothy Garton nodding in agreement. And yeah, I got the impression that you want to add something to that.
I do. I agree with almost everything Nathalie said, but I happened just to have come back from Ceuta, looking at the situation there. And just a note of caution. What happened was that in one day, people equivalent to 15% of the population of that city were allowed in from Morocco. And the trauma, Nathalie, the trauma of that experience have had a deep impact on the city, with the result that the support for Vox, the nationalist populist party, which is demanding that the frontier be totally closed and that they build a concrete wall, has gone up. So I wouldn't underestimate the effect of these crises in strengthening support for the nationalist populist right. And after all, in your own election campaign, Eric Zemmour is running precisely on this issue.
Yes, but there is probably a and I hope so, a glass ceiling to this sort of manipulation of migration fear. And I would not portray Ceuta as what takes place in continental Europe. This is a very specific area, which I know quite well, with very specific constraints and history, and I agree that there was a trauma there, and I think the blunder from Morocco was huge, but you cannot compare it with a dictator bringing migrants from other parts of the world willingly to destabilize Europe.
Yes, I agree with that entirely, but of course, the larger point about the potentially radicalizing effect in our own politics, I think, stands.
That was a closer look at the internal factors that we are also facing. I would like to get back to the external factors, because if you look at this particular situation, the migration discussion, or at others in the recent past, my impression is that somehow the EU seems to be no match for regimes that do not give in to diplomatic or economic pressure, for instance. It's not just a question of resolve, it's a question of the overall impression that we get, that the EU is not united, is not ready to stand up for itself, maybe also is not sovereign enough in foreign policy or defense questions. That's why I'd like to ask a follow-up question to Nathalie Loiseau. Your president did repeatedly lobby for stronger EU defense capacities and a more active role of the EU in security policy. Do you expect progress in this area with the next German government?
Well, in a sense, I would say, if not now, then when? We all faced the conditions in which the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. I don't blame the US for their decision to withdraw, but there were a lot of question marks and questions unanswered about the way the decision was planned, taken, and implemented with very little consultations with the European allies. Although consequences are for Europe in terms of a rising terrorist risk, in particular, if Al-Qaeda and Daesh feel emboldened and others by the victory of Taliban, Europe is one of the first targets. And I think that we all looked at what was taken place. We were repelled. We realized that for the evacuation of our nationals, we were heavily relying on the United States. Their military were tremendously helpful. But what would happen in a different place of the world where US military would not be on the ground? We had very little coordination among Europeans. And we know that there are still people on the ground which we were not able to rescue. So this is sort of a wake-up call for us to be very practical. I'm not asking, and France is not asking, and poor Europeans are not asking for a European army. What we are asking for is to be able to act in different circumstances and in different frameworks within NATO, which remains the cornerstone of our security, bilaterally if we have to, and autonomously at the European level if we have to. So far, our military external missions at the European Union level have weak mandates, have fourth generations problems. We decide at the council level, for instance, to send a military training mission to Mozambique for obvious reasons, and then it takes 6 months to get the first people on the ground, which is extremely slow, and we don't live in a vacuum. Others come, and especially mercenaries, which go against human rights. So we have to be more active, we have to be better organized, we have to realize that soft power comes with hard power as well, because we have to realize that we are not exactly at peace. And I listened carefully to what Heiko was saying, and this was this very traditional German way of thinking that after all things are not that bad, and after all status quo is something that you're comfortable with. I don't completely disagree, but I don't totally agree as well. I mean, our Eastern Partnership is in shambles. Western Balkans can explode anytime. Southern neighborhood is unstable. And we cannot always count on the United States and NATO to take care of it. So we have to get used to be taken seriously, to be respected, which I'm not a warmonger. I'm not saying that we have to trigger wars, but I think that a number of authoritarian regimes are testing us right now. If they don't see that we are firm, they don't see that we are determined, we might pay a high price for this.
You mentioned Afghanistan as a wake-up call, and there was a broad discussion in Germany too. I have to turn to Franziska Brantner on this question because she's part of a party which might be part of our future German government. 2 out of 3 parties involved do not stand for taking on more military responsibility in the world. When you hear these expectations, what can France and Europe expect from a future German government when it comes to this?
I think it's important, as Nathalie Loiseau said, that we look realistically at our neighborhood and stop pretending that everything is okay and that we can just carry on as we have done in the past. And I listened to Heiko Maas, and he was talking about German interests and that they have to stop being a prolongation of interior debates. First of all, I think it's almost impossible to say where do interior politics start and stop and the external policies start and stop. And secondly, I would always say that the biggest problem we have is that we do not define them as European interests. That if we really want to make a difference in this world, we have to define our German interests via the lens of Europe and where we want to be as Europeans. And that we stop doing German interests as equaling German economic interests, because that's basically what we have done in the past in many situations. And I think that this is the shift that hopefully we can get to build the foundations for the European Union to be more capable to act. And I would say yes, in the military domain, we need to create more synergies, more capabilities, but also more conceptual frameworks for making those missions successful. Because Nathalie, what you said is right, it takes long to establish them, but they're also not very successful. They don't have a good track record, rather a poor one. So it's not just about having more, but they need to improve. But secondly, we need to have the foundations when it comes to our digital infrastructure, our energy infrastructure. We need to become more resilient when it comes to our health infrastructure. So this is what we need to build up, this resilience in a network of keeping, of course, us internationally open. This network is wonderful, but it needs us to be more resilient and more capable to act. And I hope that we as Germans can be part of that transition of making the EU more strategically sovereign. And I think that for this, we as Germans really have to change course. If we just continue, I think we will pay a very high price for it. And if you allow me, Nathalie, when you said Europe is not vulnerable because of migration, seriously, I think that this issue has been poisoning your French debate now for years. And it's painful to watch your French campaign and debate in the upcoming elections. And I think this is a real vulnerability we have there.
But I would like to follow up because how can Germany help for instance, in situations where we need to rescue Europeans from an area of crisis, as Afghanistan, because we utterly failed there. And how can Germany do its part that something like this will not happen again?
We have been advocating for having more integration of our military forces by creating synergies, by not having 17 systems and none of them is really working. We have been criticizing the former or the still standing defense minister for not having given enough leadership to advance the projects with France, for having put German, I think sometimes difficult institutional structures there. So I think that we have been a force of really advocating here German, French, and enlarged European cooperation. And on Afghanistan, really the problem is much broader than just a military question. So I think, yes, we need to work on the military side, but we also really need to work on what needs to be the framework for a military mission. When we talk about Mali, what is really our policy objective there? What do we do? How do we deal with the North? So I think there, I'm more critical of the French position when it comes to what is our objective in these countries. What do we do in addition to the military side to achieve them? And I think, if we improve it, we make it more successful. I'm also hopeful we can convince more Germans.
We have another roughly 8 minutes for our closed panel session before we open up the floor for questions. And I'd like to represent a hypothesis. I think a prerequisite for more cooperation within the European Union would be more unity in the first place. And when it comes to that, chances for making the EU future-proof seem to be quite low, I think. Bernadett, Szél, Viktor Orbán created the expression of illiberal democracy. He set off a wave of deliberalization, especially in Eastern Europe, which is dividing the European Union in two. But you personally believe that deliberalization is not irreversible. You're also fighting for that in your campaign. Do you hope for more support when it comes to this from a German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz?
Well, we have been going through a very difficult time because really I just wanted to give this message to you that we mustn't separate economic interest and values. I think they go hand in hand. And that's a big lesson for us because if we leave these autocratic figures go along with their economic interest, and we keep on saying ourselves that we can pacify them and we can negotiate them and we can have a dialogue with them, I must tell you that that doesn't work. They do not get pacified, but they get radicalized. And currently in Hungary, we have seen a big propaganda campaign talking about the EU as well. And there was an emoji out in the streets and saying, a mad face, like, for a child, this mad face, and saying that, are you angry with the EU? And that was the message. And that has been going on long years until we ended up like that. So my biggest message about this whole situation is that in the EU, we must keep on hanging on our values, and we mustn't separate them from economic interest. Because what happens in my country is that a lot of EU taxpayers' money and decent people's money is spent on corruption, and it's an economic backlash to the EU as well. And politically, it's a big problem as well, because currently EU is being destroyed by Mr. Orbán, and giving a constant challenge to many EU countries in a very important time when unity and getting together and cooperation is an absolute must because of climate change and migrants crisis and a lot of other things.
Sorry, I was just distracted by the call for the last 20 minutes, but we still have 5 minutes left. I think at the center of this debate is the expression is the rule of law, and the European Commission that's fighting, especially with Poland and Hungary right now, about this topic. And Timothy Garton, when we look at this, do we need a more active German government to protect the rule of law in the European Union? Would that help?
We emphatically do. It's not just the rule of law. Just to underline what Bernadett Szél has just been saying, what has happened in Hungary over the last 10 years is truly shocking. You have had the systematic erosion of democracy, not just the rule of law, democracy. Many political scientists would say Hungary today is no longer a democracy, it's a hybrid system, something like a competitive authoritarian system, while the country has been a full member state of the European Union and using massive financial transfers from the EU. Boris Johnson only talks about having his cake and eating it. Viktor Orban has actually done it. And that is really a fundamental threat, together with the challenge from Poland to the rule of law, both to the legal order of the entire EU, but also to the EU as a community of democracies. Now, Germany has to be somewhat restrained in relation to Poland because of history. There, France and other countries have to take the lead. After all, Poland is the only European country I know which makes favorable reference to Napoleon Bonaparte in its national anthem. The EU has to insist on the rule of law. Germany is by far the most important partner of Hungary. 1/3 of Hungary's industrial exports are related to the German car-making industry. So in relation to Hungary, I would expect much clearer and more decisive action from Germany specifically. And Europe as a whole has at long last to make an effective linkage between the Europe of values and the Europe of money.
I have to turn to Franziska Brantner again. Of course, we do not know yet if you will be part of a German government, but you seem to be quite close to a coalition agreement at last. The rule of law might be one of the very few topics where all three parties negotiating right now might be exactly on the same page. So can you already tell us what could be the first steps to ensure the rule of law within the EU under a new German government?
I think it's much along the lines of what Timothy just said, that the German government has to be precise and clear. And I hear the call from Bernadett when she says, please do support us and do link economic in that sense, you know, our German industry, but also European financial aid to our values. And I think that this is something that we need to pursue. And yes, Germany has this bridge building function, but the question is, if you have a bridge to nowhere, what does this bridge help you? And why do you build bridges on the one side when it comes to the rule of law, and at the same time you don't build bridges when it comes to deep security interests of these countries? I just say Nord Stream 2. So I think we have to be, you know, tougher on the rule of law and more accepting their security interests when it comes to Eastern Europeans, I think very valid concerns vis-à-vis Putin. So I hope that we can make that shift, being tougher on the rule of law and democracy, being more considerate of their security interests. I hope we can make that shift, and I think it would help us and help, you know, I hope that the opposition will win in Hungary. I think that we can support it much more, that Germany also, or German politicians, let me put it this way, that it's in our own interest to also support you. I always regret, Timothy, that we all did listen to the call from the British politicians at the time not to come to the UK in the referendum time, and that we couldn't come to make in the case for Europe. I think looking back, many say you should have come and made an, you know, also the sign that you do care about us in the UK. And I hope that we can give that sign that we do care about Hungarian citizens and that we want Hungary to be part of a democratic Europe. And I deeply do care about this. And I hope that we can send these signals more strongly.
Could I add just one sentence? There is something quite specific. There is an agreed mechanism of rule of law conditionality, which the European Commission is still not implementing. And the quite concrete step would to say, stop dithering, stop sending letters, just get on with it and actually implement the mechanism agreed by the EU.
All right, thank you. I have to keep an eye on time. Our time for the closed discussion is up. We're now opening the discussion for your questions. And we already have one first question, which was pre-recorded on video, and it comes from Ambika Vishwanath from Mumbai.
Hi, good afternoon from India. This is not pre-recorded, this is a live message, so I'm going to refer to a couple of things everybody said. My name is Ambika Vishwanath. I'm the co-founder and director of Kuber9 Initiative. We are a small think tank based in Mumbai. And I want to, if possible, open up this discussion of we're talking about an era of transformation and the rule of law to a wider space, if I may. And I want to refer to a few things. One, the minister talked about new perspectives, and then we had Ms. Brantner, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, talk about, rightly so, towards Hungary, but I would hope if her party comes into power, into a larger perspective of bringing in new partners going forward. So in that sense, also touching a little bit upon Afghanistan, whether we're talking about climate change or whether we're talking about different aspects of what's going on in the Indo-Pacific region, if Hungary has a certain number of expectations that Germany and the European Union can hopefully bridge going forward, coming from India and this part of the world, can we have some of these expectations as well? And what kind of expectations can we have, both from a new German government, within Germany and within the European Union, on more inclusive decision-making structures and more inclusive decision-making conversation going forward, I mean, from a wider global space, whether we're talking about Afghanistan, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about China, or new trade policies, new trade agreements, or any of these areas that have been discussed so far. And in that, then, a little add-on to that question, if I may, Germany and several countries within Europe now have this conversation on more gender mainstreaming in their foreign policy, in their trade policy, and hopefully more areas going forward. And is that a lens that could possibly be applied to this conversation of new perspectives and an era of transformation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sorry again for making you a pre-recorded video. I had it somewhere in my notes, was wrong there. Franziska Brantner, big expectations.
Yeah, thank you for your questions, and good afternoon back to Mumbai. I want to take out your point of making more inclusive networks and taking India, for example, as a more important partner when it comes to climate change, but also democracy, etc. And I hope that we will be able to do this. Also to create climate partnerships, really, around the world. And help to develop joint technologies, approaches, and then there's much I think that we can do and must do actually. And I hope that our German industry will diversify as well. We have seen that we have become more dependent on China during the Corona crisis, which is, I think, counterintuitive. You would say, we have seen how difficult it is, but so India is one partner.
And I'm sorry, the gender mainstreaming?
Yes, sorry, there was many questions. Yeah, I hope that. Sorry, what else? The gender mainstreaming. I hope that we can have a more inclusive foreign policy that looks at power structures and how they impact peace and security. And there are good examples already within the EU how this is working. And we've seen on the ground that it's very effective. So I hope we can use it even more. We have seen steps by the former foreign minister, I must say, but I hope we can take this further.
Thank you very much. We now come to the questions that I'm getting here via the iPad. And I think there's a question which might go to Nathalie Loiseau. How should Germany provide the French EU presidency support in 2022 to create more synergies in European security and defense policy?
I think synergy already started when the Europeans altogether decided to engage into a process of what we call the strategic compass, which is basically the first white book of European defense. It started under German presidency and it should be adopted under French presidency, which is a little more than a symbol. It means that we started by working on threat analysis and sharing our threat analysis among the 27, which was an important first step. Now we have to find appropriate answers. And we should not shy away from taking pragmatic, realistic, and ambitious decisions. European defense is not turning our back away from NATO. Is becoming a strong European pillar of NATO. If you really believe in NATO, as I do, you have to acknowledge that NATO is not going through the best phase in its history. It has to be strengthened. And this is the responsibility of Europeans to be better organized, better coordinated, to be better prepared to a number of different threats. So we need Germany to fully engage in this. I think it will. A few instruments that we have created some years ago, for instance, PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation among member states on defense capabilities, is a good thing, but I know that Germany has always insisted, as a tradition, to make it very inclusive. That was a good first start, because we had to try to have a majority of member states on board. But now we don't have to shy away from trying to focus on excellence, on added value, to make it really something, a tool of European sovereignty, to be able to do more and to do better than what we are doing now. And I'm confident that we should stop discussing very theoretical issues like strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. We should walk the walk, stop talking, and just decide that we need to be more relevant, more resilient, more reliable partners, and make the best to be respected.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of questions concerning the future course of Germany in foreign politics, and I'm very sorry if I can't tell who is giving these, who's asking these questions, because on this iPad it seems it's all questions from Judith. I don't believe that it's only one person, but maybe the administrator. So please forgive me if I don't say your name, the name that belongs to the question. There's a question for you. Will the Greens be able to pursue a normative foreign policy?
I hope that we will, no, I'm not just hoping, I'm sure that we will not give up on our European values, and that we know that we have to defend them in a more difficult world. And I think that we have to protect our European citizens, we have to defend our democracy at home, within our own countries, within the EU, and also support those who do it outside. And I was very happy when our President Steinmeier yesterday talked precisely about memorial. And I think, you know, it's very important to do this. And this doesn't exclude that you still do talk to China on trade, on climate, that you do talk to Putin on climate, on other issues. Of course you do this, but I think that we should not forget why we're doing the foreign policy. And like, you know, it's nice to say we do talk to everybody, yes, but with what purpose? What's the objective? And I think that this should be still clear. And I always believe that we should define these interests and values in a European perspective and not just a German one.
You are expressing a hope, but where do you see the restrictions for making it come true?
You know, I can't talk now from inside the coalition talks, but I think, you know, this balance between being tough on the one side, being in dialogue and solving international problems, it's a tension. There is a balancing effort that you have to do all the time. And my fear is that after the Afghanistan failure, we go all the other way around and say, now we just do pragmatic, realist policies and give up on all the values. And I think we shouldn't fall into that trap to go from one side to the other, but we really have to struggle to find always the right balance. And it is a continuous struggle. It's much more demanding than going one or the other side. And this, I think, will be the challenge of the next government. And I'm sure that we will be there to make sure it doesn't fall to just the other side.
There is one question which is rather a comment. We are discussing exactly the same questions that we discussed in Europe for the last 5 years, especially during the Trump administration. Did the EU fail to do the homework regarding its ability to act and forming a political will? I would like to give this question first to someone who is experiencing firsthand what it means if it goes wrong and if you exit the European Union. Timothy Garton. Did they fail to do their homework?
Listen, I'm actually working on a history of contemporary Europe, and if you look at the last decade, it's one crisis after the other: Eurozone crisis, Ukraine crisis, refugee crisis, Brexit crisis, Poland and Hungary crisis, Trump crisis, and then COVID crisis. So it's not surprising that the European Union has been staggering under the impact of successive crises. If you look at the whole history of the European Union and before it the European community, the key to moving forward has been when you have coalitions of the willing, a number of significant member states wanting to move in a certain direction, working with the European institutions that also have a plan, as for example Jacques Delors did in the 1980s. Now the opportunity we have at the moment, the opportunity is that with the new German government, which is itself a kind of coalition of the willing of three reformist pro-European parties, but with very different platforms, you get a larger European coalition of the willing. So assuming that Emmanuel Macron is re-elected, and let's hope, there's obviously a question mark there, you have Germany and France, you have a close, now almost special relationship between France and Italy under Mario Draghi, to be symbolized by the new Quirinale Treaty between France and Italy. You have very sensible pro-European governments in Spain, the Netherlands and elsewhere. And so the opportunity is that you've got the critical mass of a European coalition of the willing and can actually move forward. The difficulty is the one that Franziska Brantner identified, that if you have a German coalition of the willing at the heart of a European coalition of the willing, you're necessarily going to have a lot of compromises between the different positions of parties and national governments. And are those compromises still going to enable us to have really effective action? But certainly looking at it as a historian, I would say this is a moment of great opportunity and we need to seize it.
Will compromises be enough to get Hungary back on the European track, Bernadett, Szél? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. These are very interesting times, and compromises doesn't mean that we are paralyzed. It means that there is a point of breakthrough, whether we see it or not, and it's always up to the people's how brave they are, whether they see this opportunity to go for ahead and to move, and then I think we can shift to a totally different level, I would say so. For example, in my country, we have seen, as we have discussed before, that democracy basically that have been killed. Such thing that illiberal democracy does not exist. It's not a democracy anymore, it's an autocracy. And now we, in the opposition, managed to find a common ground for ourselves, and our ideas and our motivations for the future are much more progressive I have ever seen in Hungary before, since the regime change. So it can be a real breakthrough. It really reminds me the moment when we joined the European Union, and I think now we can have a celebration to our democracy if we manage it in the springtime. Of course, it's very difficult, and we can see our counterparts moves, how they try to move things backwards, I would say so. But still, if our motivation goes forward and we keep going, then we can make it. And that's what I feel about the whole European story as well.
a lot of positive perspective here on this panel. I have a name here and a question. Ilya Tüchter is asking, will the new government in Berlin kill Nord Stream 2 to make good on the goal of putting values over money? This is a tough one for you, Franziska Brantner. We know the Greens were tending to do so, but will they do it in a German government?
Yeah, Ilya Tüchter, who asked the question, knows that I've been fighting against Nord Stream 2 for years. So, you know, I think that part of that is history, and I think it's right that the German Bundesnetzagentur is checking seriously that European law is actually implemented. And it will be important to also get the advice and opinion from the European Commission. And I think, you know, that we all have to make sure that we do keep European law, that we do keep the European interests there. And I think that now the big goal must be to become less dependent on the Russian gas. And that's why we have to quickly and really massively do build up our own renewable energies here. Because otherwise next fall we will have the next gas crisis and the fall afterwards as well. So I think that should be a motivation to go ahead, which also, by the way, makes sense for climate protection, but it's also in our strategic and security interest.
I have a question by Rishabh Gupta. What role will the EU play in an era of increasing US-China antagonism? Who wants to go first? Can we give it to Timothy again?
I think the prior question to that is, what is the nature of the challenge? And the first question to ask is, what would be the right response, not where do we position ourselves between the US and China? And the reality is that over the last decade, China has alas moved from being an authoritarian state that was making rather a positive evolution back to being a strong Leninist and in some respects neo-totalitarian state, and one with a very assertive foreign policy. That is the nature of the challenge. And our response has to be, and I think even Heiko Maas acknowledged it, that we have to change our all-European policy, including Britain in this respect. Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, is one of the illusions to which Heiko Maas was referring. It hasn't worked. The interests of the German car industry are not identical with the interests of Europe or the democratic world. What we need is what we had in German Ostpolitik at its best, a twin-track policy, a policy which at this one time, on the one side clearly has large economic engagement, scientific ties, cultural ties, cooperation on issues like climate change, by the way, on a much larger scale than we ever had during the Cold War, but on the other hand, does have clear lines of containing or constraining China. And in this respect, it's partly about defending the integrity of our own democracies. Because, for example, we have problems of self-censorship in our own universities in relation to China, in our own media, but also geostrategically. And here, may I just say a quick word about AUKUS. What was so unfortunate about AUKUS was that France is probably the only European country beside Britain which really takes seriously the notion of geostrategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And what we need is a joint European and American geostrategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, so that I think Europe needs to land in that place of a new Ostpolitik with the twin-track approach.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that we can't go through all the questions that you sent us, because our time is, do you say over? I'm sorry. Now I'm getting mixed up in my languages. That was our opening panel. Thank you very much to all our panelists for this very vivid and engaged discussion. And thank you to all of you joining us from outside and sending us questions and listening intently. And I hope you will join the following parts of the program here in Berlin and enjoy them very much. Thank you very much. Have a good day.